Okay, so our next speaker for today, this afternoon, will be Dr. Derald Holtkamp. He's an associate professor out at VD-PAM here at Iowa State University Vet School. The title today will be Progress in Biosecurity and Risk Assessment of Swine Diseases. So the description today will be following the introduction of PED in 2013. The pork industry got serious about improving biosecurity. Lowering incidence of PED and PRRS outbreaks recently indicates that improvements are working. This presentation will cover recent research on disinfectants and bench entry system into sow farms, as well as risk assessment and outbreak investigation. Dr. Holtkamp's research focuses on biosecurity, as well as economics and risk assessment of swine diseases, with emphasis on PRRS and PED. He conducts outbreak investigations for PRRS and PED and is developing standard procedures for conducting and reporting on outbreak investigations. He is directing the production animal disease risk assessment program at Iowa State University, focusing on development, management, promotion of disease risk assessment tools, and databases of completed risk assessments held by the American Association of Swine Veterinarians. So that's.
Thanks, Austin. Got to make that shorter. He's out of breath.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us this afternoon here. I'm, as Austin said, Derald Holtkamp. I grew up on a cattle farm in southeast Iowa and showed cattle for years. Never really got interested in swine until I started vet school in 1997, and then started working with a gentleman at University of Minnesota named Gary Dial, and he's kind of dropped out of the industry now, but used to be kind of one of the icons of the industry. And got my DVM, though, from Iowa State in 1997. Before that, though, I did a master's in economics, also from Iowa State. And before that, a bachelor's in ag business, also from Iowa State. So I don't have any mixed loyalties there. So today, what I want to talk to you about, or give you some information on, is some work that we've been doing on outbreak investigation programs. And then I also want to talk a little bit about a bench study that was done last summer. And so to motivate you a little bit, I guess, as to why this might be something you want to hear about and hopefully give you some interest in hearing about this, that it's been 30 years now since PRRS first came onto the scene. It was in 1987, 1988, where they first started recognizing this syndrome. And it was shortly after that then they identified the specific virus that was associated with it. But 30 years, and yet it's still the most costly disease, swine disease, we have in the U.S. and I think you can easily say in the world, except for the few places like Australia and supposedly Brazil that don't have it. But according to the estimates here that we did for National Pork Board back in 2010, it costs $664 million per year, and I think that if you do the math, that's I forget how much it was on a per day, about 1.8 million on a daily basis, I think. And so why is that? Well, one of the reasons why it's still so costly is that it's very, wrong button there, Austin. Sorry, I don't take instruction very well, so he told me this was the pointer. One of the reasons why it's so costly yet is that it's very prevalent. So every year we have about 20 to 40% of our sow herds have outbreaks, and every time that happens, they wean pigs that are positive for the virus for 20, 30 weeks after that, and then those pigs get distributed throughout the country. And so if I'm a PRRS virus, I'm looking at that and saying, hey, this is a good deal for me, this is a good situation. And so it's no wonder why 30 years into this, we're still struggling with it. All right, and still I'm going the wrong way here. There we go. So what's the solution then? If there's probably not one solution, but I do think, in my opinion, the biggest challenge that we still have is stopping these outbreaks in breeding herds. Okay, and I think as long as we keep having those outbreaks every year at 20 to 40%, we're not going to get on top of this. So, to me, this is, if you ask me what is the one thing we have to solve for PRRS to make progress, this is it. Okay. And so, to address that, we've got a lot of history under our belt on what agents can carry the pathogen into a herd. Okay, so lots of good experimental research that's been done over the years that shows that semen, of course, and we've known that for 20, 22, 23 years now. People, trucks, trailers, you name it. One of the things that's characteristic of the PRRS virus, it's not necessarily characteristic of every virus though, is that it can be shed in nearly every excretion or secretion of a pig, right? So it really can be tossed out anywhere. It can infect or contaminate or infect contaminate just about anything. So that's what we know. We know that there are lots of possible ways that the virus can move around. What we don't know, though, yet is what are the most frequent ways that pathogens move around, okay? And that is a critical question because until we can answer that question, it's very hard to decide where to focus our efforts, where to allocate resources to try to do this, to stop transmission from herd to herd, right? So that's one of the challenges we have. So yet today we don't know how to do that, and really experimental research can't help us answer that question. To answer that question, we've got to go out and observe. We've got to systematically go out and observe how outbreaks are occurring, okay? Or try to anyway. And so in order to address that, we, back in 2013, our Pork Producers Association actually was looking for some tools to help support some of these regional PRRS control projects. And so I said, well, maybe an outbreak investigation program would be a good way to start to systematically try to observe and see how outbreaks are occurring, and so that we can learn from that. And so they funded that project, and they've actually just funded it now for the 5th year. So we're funded again now through the summer of 2018. Basically, we've worked mainly with PRRS regional control projects, and we got about 28 herds that are enrolled right now in the pilot, and we've done some outbreak investigations on some herds outside of that pilot as well, on the specific request of veterinarians or companies. So the objectives of that program then been to identify the cause of the outbreak, to see if we can identify gaps in biosecurity, and then really our long-term goal and how we would measure success is to reduce the frequency of outbreaks in these breeding herds. Okay? Now the challenge we have with this is you can't do that year to year. Okay? An outbreak in a breeding herd is not failure. It's not a measure of failure, right? There's variations. Stuff happens. You have outbreaks. It doesn't mean you're not making progress. Okay? If you're making lots of changes to biosecurity, you've got to measure that over 5 years at a minimum. Okay? 1, 2 years, 3 years time is not enough, and every outbreak is not a measure of failure. And so systematic observation then, again, is required. And the thing that's nice about outbreak investigations is it gives us an opportunity to learn from our mistakes. And those of you who recall Al Lehman, who the Minnesota Layman Conference is named after, one of his, probably the most common quote you hear attached to him is, one of the problems we have in the pig industry is we don't make mistakes fast enough. And sort of what he was implying there is that we learn from our mistakes, and so if we want to learn faster, we need to make mistakes faster. And I've had 20 years now to mull that over, and I think he's probably right about that, but I think there's a caveat to that, and or maybe call it a modification, and that is that I think we do make mistakes fast enough. We just don't learn from them very, very much. Many times, we have PRRS outbreaks over and over and over and over again, and we never change anything, right? We just the same thing keeps happening to us. And so that's not the solution there is not to make mistakes faster, it's to learn better from the mistakes that we make. All right, and so that's what we're trying to do. And one of the approaches we developed early on, or thought was important anyway, was to try to standardize this. And I, kind of leading up to this, I had a chance to be involved in quite a few outbreak investigations, either that I've done or others have done, and I've had a chance to view the reports or talk to them about the results. And I can tell you they're all over the board, in terms of what they assess and what they include in a report, and what they learn and what action comes out of it, right? Did anybody make a change as a result of it, right? All over the board. Everybody kind of does their own thing, and we all got our pet peeves. We think it's trailers, or we think it's air, we think it's people. We all got our thing that we focus on. And so what we want to do is step back and say, all right, can we do this in a standardized way that's comprehensive and will help us overcome our personal biases and more objectively look at every case as an individual case. And so we developed this investigation form here then that we use, and this is just the cover of it, but it basically has several parts. We start, kind of summarize the PRRS history for the farm, the current information on the current outbreak. We give a little bit of information about the herd characteristics, the premises, our characteristics of the premises. And then we have the meat of it is this set of standard questions that we have about risk events. And I'll talk a little bit what I mean by risk events here in a second here. So we had to step back and say, okay, how do we want to do this in a comprehensive, systematic way? And so we stepped back and said, well, let's first of all recognize that the PRRS virus and other pathogens don't have their own way to get around. They don't have legs or wings or any other way to locomote. So something has to carry them into a herd, right? And so we labeled that something else a carrying agent here. And so you won't find that in a lot of epidemiology textbooks. I actually found it, and it was attributed to Dr. Jim Roth, and in one place. And so I thought, yeah, that's a very good term to describe that. So forget about fomites, forget about biological vectors and all the distinguishing things that you'll read in epi textbooks. The only thing that really matters is what can carry it in, either by being infected or contaminated. That's all I care about. I just want to label it, carrying agent, okay? Interesting thing was, when I mentioned that to Dr. Roth, his response was, what's that? And then I had to remind him that he coined the term. So, but anyway, I think it fits very well. All right, and so then what is a risk event? So a risk event then is any time carrying agents, one or more carrying agents come into a farm, we're going to call that a risk event. And so when in this case, a pig will come with the trailer and the driver and a few other carrying agents. When he enters that premises, crosses that perimeter of that farm, that is a risk event has occurred there, okay? And some risk events, if you think about it, are identified by a specific date and time. So the day that gilt trailer shows up, we can put a date and a time on that, right? But air is another carrying agent, and it doesn't show up on the calendar. It's coming in continuously. Insects are continuous, right? So some of these events we can't put a date and time on, but a good share of them we can. All right, so just to give you a couple examples to get your head around this. So one example of a risk event here is semen delivery to the farm. So semen enters the farm. So think about what are the carrying agents that come with semen when semen is delivered to you? Well, you got the semen itself, of course, and for PRRS, we know that is the way the semen, or that the PRRS virus can get there, right? Not for every pathogen, but for PRRS, it can do that. You also have the packaging. You have the driver, if it's couriered to the farm. The vehicle, if it's couriered to the farm, the driver of the vehicle. And then in certain circumstances, you may have some other carrying agents, right? So these are kind of the biggies that we see most frequently, but every now and then something pops up that we hadn't really thought about before. One more example, feed delivered to the farm. I'll give you just a moment to look at that. This won't be a quiz, I won't ask you to tell me, but just look at that for a little bit and see if you can identify for the feed delivery event, what carrying agents might come with that event. I'll start with the hardest one to see, the driver, right? He could be a potential carrying agent. The feed itself would be a potential carrying agent, and then the trailer or the feed truck would be another potential carrying agent, right? All right, so when we're doing investigations, we're going to consider all three of those. All right, the other examples of risk events, and this is not a comprehensive list. If you want the whole list, I can give that to you. But semen delivery is one. Cull sow removal would be another risk event. Feed delivery, and on-farm employee entry, and manure removal. Okay, so just 5 examples there. The important thing, though, to think about here is that the complete list is not that much bigger. Okay, and it's small enough that in bullet form, I can get it all on one page in a Word document easily, probably half a page, or maybe about a page. Okay, so if you and I sat down in an afternoon and maybe an hour, we could probably think through and come up with that comprehensive list, even if we started from scratch. Okay, so that's doable. But the list of carrying agents is much longer, right? If you start thinking about what are all the things that come into farm, that's a lot harder to get your head around, I think, or at least it was for me. And so it really does help to start with risk events first, and then think about, okay, what carrying agents come with that risk event, and then work it that way. So that's been a big deal. It sounds simple, but it's a big deal. All right, so as far as procedures go, then when we do outbreak investigations now, we've kind of standardized this as well. For when we go out, we have a veterinary outbreak facilitator. All right, and sometimes that's myself, sometimes that's one of my students, sometimes that's somebody that works with me, but it's somebody that's got some experience under their belt of doing these, and they have a good idea of kind of how to approach this, what to ask. And then we usually have two. We'll have somebody that will be responsible for asking the questions and responding to what we're told and following up so that we get the information we're after. And then there's a second person who is frantically taking notes to get everything down and is going to then be responsible for putting the summary report together. And that person also then keeps the main facilitator on track to make sure they haven't missed something. So we got kind of two eyes and ears, sets of ears out there listening. The other two most important people to have at the table is the herd veterinarian and the farm manager usually. It's that one person who knows what's going on or knows what went on that farm before the outbreak occurred. Okay? And so this is the main person, frankly, that we want to talk to. And so we have in the investigation form, we have a set of embedded questions in that. And those questions help guide us through the interview. And so it guides us on what we want to ask about. And so if we skip an entire area, then we can remind ourselves that we didn't ask about that. But we don't ask it like a survey. We don't go out and say, do you do this? Yes or no. Do you do this? Yes or no. It's done in an open-ended way. And so we'll start out, when we start assessing semen entry, we'll say, okay, the first question is, all right, before the outbreak occurred, and we usually go back in a 4-week window before the first signs were seen. In that window of time, when was semen brought in? And the response to that one is usually every Tuesday and Thursday or something like that, right? For gilt entry, when did you bring gilts in during that 4-week window? The answer may be no, we didn't. So we're not going to focus on gilts as much then, okay? Because it probably wasn't, if the event didn't occur during that time, it probably didn't contribute to the outbreak. But that's the first question. And then the second question is, tell us how you do that. Tell us how you bring semen into the farm, okay? And we let them start talking. And you'll never be able to develop a survey where you'll capture all the information that's relevant, right? So that's why we do it in an open-ended way, because a lot of the stuff we capture in the closed-ended questions is important because, again, it guides us, but it also then is going to form a database, right? And now we can go back and start combining data from multiple outbreaks in that database. So that's important, but we don't want to forget about the other stuff that's important too. And that's why it's important to ask it in an open-ended way. And I mentioned already, then we use that 4-week investigation period prior to the first clinical sign. So with PRRS, it's a little tougher, right? I mean, sometimes they don't know for sure, when that outbreak or when the virus was first introduced. That's really what we're interested in, is when did that virus first get introduced into the herd. For PED, it's a little easier when we do those investigations. Okay, it's a little more dramatic, and pretty much you can count back from the day pigs started dying by the incubation period, and you got pretty much the day it came in. PRRS is a little bit more difficult to do that, though. All right, so what are we looking for then? We're looking for what we call operational connections to other swine or swine-related premises. And for example, we may be investigating this farm, and we may know that this farm over here has a virus that's very similar. And to know that, we have to have a database of sequences. Is this, to me, this sounds like it's echoing. Do you guys hear that? It's okay? Okay. Maybe it's just me then, Roy. My ears must be ringing. So.
Sir, closer you get to this space, you might hear some echo.
Oh, is that what it?
Yeah,
okay. I'm going to stay away from you then. I'll go over here. All right. So, yeah, that's better. Okay, I like that. I don't hear it. All right. All right, so operational connection. So we got maybe 2 farms here. This is the farm we might be investigating that had the outbreak, and we might know there's a sequence very similar over here, right? And so then during the investigation, we're going to be very aware and ask questions about potential connections to this farm. And so in the case here, we may find out that the same company that hauls cull sows for them to the plant in this nearby town may also haul for them. In fact, we may find out that they happened to be on the same route 3 days before the outbreak occurred. Okay, so that would be things we're going to look for. If you're going to do that, though, you have to have information about other swine premises in the area, right? And for PRRS, it's not good enough to know whether they're positive or not because there's too darn many of them, right? There's a lot of positive farms nearby in most of the places we're working in Iowa. And so we need to know a little bit more detail than that. We need to know specific sequences of viruses. And we're looking for then isolates of the virus that are very similar in terms of homology, and that requires that they have done a sequence and that those sequences are in a database somewhere. Okay, now that happens more often than it used to, but the source of those databases then typically are these regional control projects, and they've all gotten together and agreed to share those sequences. But it also happened even before those projects got going in production systems and veterinary clinic databases. Okay, so your veterinarian probably has a database of sequences that includes sequences he's done for you as well as other clients in the area, and certainly in production systems they have that too. Okay, so we have that available. Cases where the operational connections were important. So I'm just going to give you a few examples of times when that operational connection was important. We had one case here where a farm employee visited, or not visited, but did chores on a finisher. So he had two jobs. In other words, he worked on the breeding herd or on the sow farm, but he also had a job choring at the finisher. Okay, and sometimes he did that, or most of the time I think even he did it at the end of the day, but not all the time. Sometimes he did that in the middle of the day. On this farm, I think they also went out to lunch a lot. So we said, well, okay, that's interesting. And we also knew that finisher he chored at received pigs from a sow farm that had an isolate that was 99.7% similar. Okay, so we had a match pretty much there. That was close enough. And if you think about this, you got an employee that's going back and forth every day, right? What is the chance he's going to get contaminated when he goes works that finisher? Almost 100%, right? The pigs are shedding, actively shedding. He's in there among them. He's working, dragging out deads, cleaning out feed troughs. He's going to be contaminated pretty much every day. So what happens then? He comes back to the sow farm, right? And we've put all of our eggs now in the basket of, okay, well, that shower better darn well work, right? Because if it doesn't work, he's going to track that in, and he's going to contact animals directly in the sow farm, right? So you kind of think that through that, and you think, oh my God, that's that's pretty bad, right? And yet these things happen all the time on sow farms, right? And because we're not, I don't want to say we're not paying attention, but not focused on this, you know, some of these big, it's like somebody swinging a sledgehammer in your area and you don't know it. You're just kind of walking around and you hope you get lucky, but you might, if you walk in the path, you might get hit in the head. So these things happen. In this case, you know, this was one we kind of determined was probably a smoking gun, you know, and we looked at, you know, kind of how employees entered too, and decided that, you know, that the way they enter was probably not that good, enough. It was not good enough to 100% of the time. Probably nothing's good enough 100% of the time, but we thought it was pretty likely that, you know, one of those days he probably got through the shower. So that's one example where an operational connection, and again, we had the sequences. Another one was a case where they received semen from Borsted. We didn't get one of these, though, for a long time. This was a recent investigation that we did. So I was starting to think, you know, we've pretty much got the Borsteds handled now, and we just didn't see any outbreaks. But we finally had one, and so again, the easy one there, right? Borsted becomes infected. We can sequence that virus, sequence the one that's caused the outbreak, and they match, and you're pretty confident that's what did it, right? So that was number two. And then the third one here, we had a case where the veterinarian mixed up a lot of virus for live virus inoculation. So he was doing the prep work, and that particular virus was extremely prevalent in that area, and so there was a lot of people using that virus for live virus inoculation. And it was also located, or had been isolated from a lot of farms, of course, probably mostly due because it was being used for LVI. But the farm manager then would once a week come and pick up supplies, not LVI obviously, not virus because they were not positive before this, but he would pick up other supplies, vaccines, antimicrobials from the vet clinic, right? And so what we kind of assessed, or what we took out of that was, we've got a clinic here that's mixing up this virus for a bunch of different clients, and you've got people going in and out in that premise. Not a swine premises, but you got potential for a lot of contamination there, right? And so we thought that was one where there was a pretty strong operational connection. We didn't call that a smoking gun because that virus was just ubiquitous in that area, but we thought that was a pretty strong connection there, right? Okay, so there's a third example then how we use those information about those operational connections. Another thing we look for is timing of first clinical signs. And so my desire here is to motivate you to pay attention or get your farm managers to pay attention to the sows. Okay? And so we had 15 of 17 investigations that I'm going to summarize in this later here where they did observe clinical signs before they got diagnostic confirmation. Okay? The other two, they just were doing routine diagnostics and PRRS popped up. Okay? They never recognized at least any clinical signs. And so 15 of the 17 had clinical signs, and in fact the 13 of those also, they were able to pinpoint it to a specific area. So they may have said, well, yeah, we first saw the sows off feed in the gestation barn in row 1 and, right here, okay? And in those cases, they've got to be paying pretty close attention to get that information. And then, of course, later they learn it's a PRRS outbreak, right? So I was pretty impressed by that. I'm pretty impressed by that people seem to be really paying attention to the sows. And so examples then of how we've used that information then, there was one case here where we, again, the first clinical signs they observed was sows off feed, and it happened in an area where they had just repaired a feed line, okay? And so a repair crew came in, they brought in spare parts or parts to do that. I think a day before the repair crews got there. The day they brought those parts in, the farm manager was gone, so she didn't really have a chance to observe how that happened. And we learned also later that those parts, even though they had told us, I think in 3 previous investigations, that they never transferred parts from one farm to another, what we learned was that the parts that were used for this repair came from a big junkyard that just any excess parts they had, they threw them in there, and then if they needed them, they'd go back and get them later. And so that was a case where that timing though of that first clinical signs, that observation was critical, right? Because we knew that, and that ended up being a smoking gun then too. All right, another case, and this one was I wouldn't call it a smoking gun. It was a little bit harder to connect the dots, but they observed the first clinical signs in an area of the barn where I believe it was 1 to 2 days before that, or 3 days, I think it was actually. No, it was 1 to 2 days before that. They had dropped a manure pump outside the barns, right? So right in the same area those pigs or those sows first went off feed. And normally you'd say, well, yeah, but what's the likelihood that even if that manure pump was infected, that the virus somehow got into the sows in that area, right? And so with most of our barns, we'd say, well, yeah, that's probably not likely, right? But this was a really old barn. This was a 40-year-old barn with a large mice and bird population, right? And they had birds and mice in and out of the barns all the time. So it's a little bit easier to connect the dot there on this farm. And so that was one where, again, the timing and the location of the first clinical signs we thought was important. All right, another thing we look for is geographic proximity. So we're looking, again, for swine farms in a 3-mile radius. We oftentimes will go out to 5 miles, but normally 3, where we have farms with a similar isolate, right? So they've done a sequence, we know what that sequence is, and it's very similar to the outbreak one. That's happened in 3 cases out of the 17 where we had farms in that 3-mile radius that also had a very similar sequence. In one of those, it was a case where if you look at the wind, and we always look at the weather data, we look at 6-hour weather data in that 4-week time period before the signs were observed. It just so happened that in a lot of those days, the wind direction was such that it was going from the other farm to the farm that had the outbreak. It was in the right direction, in other words. But the problem, I guess, that we saw with that as being the cause was that it occurred in May, June, right? So the weather really wasn't ideal during that time for aerosol transmission, or even maybe you start to think insects there, but but it wasn't ideal certainly for aerosol transmission. It was just too warm, too sunny during that time. And then 2 other cases, they happened at the right time of the year for the weather to be conducive. Although the weather really didn't line up, we sort of look at wind speed, temperature, cloud cover. What else do we look at? One other relative humidity. A couple other weather variables we look at, and we've got spreadsheets set up with conditional formattings to identify days or 6-hour time periods where the weather might have been ideal for aerosol transmission. And we didn't have any days where that kind of lined up for these. And the other thing we had in both of these cases was we had a lot of operational connections to other farms in the area that had a similar sequence, including those that were 3 miles away. So it was tough to say, well, yeah, that might have been air, that might have been aerosol. You really couldn't hang our hat on that, okay? So but we do look at proximity. That's another thing we look at. And so after we're done going through each risk event, one of the things we always do now, and we started doing this in 2015, is we'll assign a likelihood to each of those risk events as to the likelihood that that event was associated with this outbreak. And we may have multiple events that have high, and sometimes we have more lows and mediums, but we sort of assess them one-off. Each case is unique, and we'll assign a high, medium, low ranking for each one. So what do we look at? Well, in addition to the operational connections, the geographic proximity, and the timing of the first clinical and location of the first clinical signs, we also look at what's required to get a virus into a farm. And what's required is a series of failures. The first thing that has to happen is that carrying agent, one or more of those carrying agents, has to become contaminated or infected. And so in the case of that employee that was going back and forth, right, the probability of that's pretty high in that case. And so that first failure has to happen. But that alone is not enough to cause an outbreak. You have to have a second failure, that is that we failed to mitigate that contamination. Okay, so there's no, that employee in this case came in and he got in with the virus, live infectious virus still on him. Okay, so but you have to have that, and even that's not good enough though. The event has to occur then, and then you have to have this last failure here where the virus gets from the carrying agent to the pig. Now, if that's the employee, that's pretty easy to see how that's going to happen, right? Because he's coming in and interacting with the pigs directly, right? But what if that's a feed truck that we have, maybe the wheel well's contaminated with a feed truck, right? Something else, something additional has to happen to get that virus from that feed truck then to the animals in the herd, right? So that last failure has to occur as well, and whether that carrying agent is going directly in the herd is going to really affect that probability. Okay, so we assess all of those for each carrying agent, for all the carrying agents. For each risk event, for all the carrying agents associated with it, we assess the likelihood of all 3 of these failures occurring. Okay, and so based on that, then we assign high, medium, and low. And this is a summary then of the 17 cases that we've done since 2015. And again, this is when we started to do this in a standardized way, and we've continued that. And so the 3 highest events were on-farm employee entry, removal of cull sows, and repairs done inside the barn. So that was the top 3. And there was 8 times we ranked those first 2 high, and 6 times we ranked repairs inside barns as a high. All right, and then in addition to that, we have another gradation, I guess, of how we rank these, and that is for some of these, we will say, the strength of the evidence is so high that we're going to call it a smoking gun. Now, that doesn't mean that we are 100% certain that that's what caused the outbreak, but it means that we have enough evidence that we think, yeah, it's a very good chance that that's what caused it, right? And so we'll label those smoking guns. And we've had more of those than I thought. I really thought it would be a rare occurrence that we'd find a smoking gun. But we've had more of those than I expected, and they were listed here. So 3 smoking guns there means we found that event here, repairs done inside the barn, we found that to be a smoking gun 3 times. So that was the most frequent one where we had it as a smoking gun. Okay, and I'll talk about those a little bit here. But all right, so what made cull sows the most frequent event? And this is not any specific case. I'm just pulling out nuggets of things we are learning from doing all these investigations where we rated cull cell removal as high. And so we saw things like the trailer was not washed between loads. We saw a few cases where they were doing a bumper-to-bumper transfer on the road, which you would say, oh yeah, that should reduce risk, and it does. But the cart they used to transport the pigs from the barn to the road wasn't washed between trips or ever. And there was one time in particular where right after they hauled the cull sows, they hauled gilts from an on-site GDU into the gestation barn, right? So if they had contaminated that cart, and you say, well, yeah, but okay, that's okay. It contaminated the cart. If we let that sit long enough, it'll kill the virus. And it probably didn't work its way back into the barn. But now you've hauled gilts with it, and you brought those right into the farm. So that you've increased your likelihood there pretty substantially that if you did contaminate that cart, you're going to bring it into the farm. So we had cases like that. A lot of them involving third-party contractors, where what it comes down to is just lack of knowledge, right? So they didn't necessarily know who or what house those trailers were hauling for or what they were hauling. And so, for example, we may have a third-party contractor that they use that they knew they hauled for other producers, but they didn't know who they were, right? Let alone where the status of the pigs or what other farms they were hauling pigs from, right? So just completely blind as to where that trailer was before it showed up on the farm. And so all they're left to do that's in their control, the farm manager anyway, is to look at that trailer and say, yeah, it looks clean, must be okay. Okay, so complete lack of knowledge there about where those trailers are going. We had one case or one investigation where there was a recent change that occurred. They had a cull truck driver that they had contracted with for years, trusted him, felt like they could rely on him to do a good job of cleaning and sanitizing that trailer between every load. And for various reasons, they couldn't use him anymore, and so they switched to a different hauler, right? And right after that, they had an outbreak. And so the timing of that caught our attention. The other thing that we saw frequently was that they put all of the burden on the contractor to sanitize and decontaminate the trailers, okay? And so they may say, it went all the way from, okay, we want you to wash the trailer between every load to they may even specify, we want you to wash and use this disinfectant. But for the most part, there was never any follow-up on whether or not they were actually doing that. Like I said, they may, if you asked the farm manager, well, was the trailer always clean when it showed up? They'd say, well, yeah, most of the time, it was pretty clean. But that was about the extent of the auditing, right? So they really were at the mercy of the third party that they were contracting with, and they never, I never got the sense that they were really making that a big issue with them, right? And if you think about it, these cull trailers are going to some pretty nasty places, all right? Market plants and cull cell plants are probably two of the best places to pick up viruses, right? So a lot of these trailers that are coming back, if they're not washed, sanitized, decontaminated very well, they're probably bringing virus to the farm. Okay? That probably happens more often than we think. I had one case too where one of the drivers they actually were doing audits, and so he had several violations, or had one big one in particular recently that they were questioning his trustworthiness. All right, the repairs inside the barn. This was one that, probably partly because it's a rare event. Normally we say, well, the more frequent the event, the greater the risk it brings, right? But there's some of these, like these repair events, that are infrequent, and because of that, they're probably a higher risk. And what I mean by that is, because they're infrequent, they don't pay attention to them, okay? One company in particular that we've done several assessments or investigations for, I'll stack them up against anybody else in the country. They really do a fantastic job with biosecurity. They're doing things that few others are doing. But this was one that fell through the cracks for them. I think it was a bit of black box, right? Nobody paid attention to it. And so we had 3 cases here where it was pretty clear it was a smoking gun, including that one I mentioned earlier where it was a repair of the feed line, was one of those. Okay? And there was 2 others that we found. Oftentimes, the people they contract for, there have been cases where they actually were company people, but there are other cases where they contract with a third party, and that third party again may do do repairs for multiple companies. They're not necessarily exclusive to the company. Oftentimes they come in without showering, not in every case. Sometimes they do shower in. And then there's another thing we often saw was that tools and supplies get entered directly. So they may have a D&D room, a drying disinfection room set up for everything else that comes in, except when they do these repairs, and then it's big stuff, and they say, well, we'll just bring them in, right? Because they don't fit in the D&D room. And so that's another thing we saw. And then this case, I mentioned this parts junkyard depot was involved here. And there was actually a house on that site as well. And I suspect by now some of you in the room have figured out who this is. But there was a house on that site that temporary employees would stay on. And oftentimes the temporary employees were people who would do repairs for them as well. And it was the most common smoking gun. And then finally, what made employee entry a high-risk event? First of all, right out of the gate, it's the most frequent event that we see on every farm. Okay, and so if you've got a 4,000 sow farm, or you've got 10 or so employees coming in every day, 10, 12 employees coming in every day, and sometimes more than once a day. And we consider each one of those a separate event. And some of the things we observed was in several cases, those employees were doing multiple jobs. The one I mentioned earlier where they worked on a finisher, one of the employees worked on a finishing barn. But we saw lots of things. They drove feed trucks, they delivered gilts, they managed a feed mill, they hauled market hogs. Okay? And a lot of it was just trying to utilize that employee. They hired him full-time and they were going to use him full-time, right? They weren't going to pay him for 40 and have him work 30 hours a week, or actually probably paying him for 40 and having him work 60 hours a week. But we had lots of those cases. And I know that doesn't happen very often. I think we probably got more of those than what would be typical of the population. But that's one where you got people going back and forth. It's a big risk. All right, and we had one shower in detached shed. And so the shower, they'd walk in, shower, walk right back out in the same place, and then walk outside and put a different pair of boots on, right? Not a very effective shower, right? There's no clean, dirty line. You're walking right through the area that you walked through when you were dirty. So we saw that. Saw cases where they reported that they would see towels on the dirty side, and anybody that's gone into many sow farms, I guarantee you, go into 5 sow farms, if you've gone into 5 or more, you've seen this, where you have towels on the dirty side, and those oftentimes end up getting tossed back to the clean side, not always. Often we had some where they were doing other duties and then lunch and smoking. It's illegal to smoke inside these barns. And so that's one of the questions we always ask, do you have smokers on the farm? Okay, and if they do, those presumably, we're told different things of how they handle that, but they almost never tell us, yeah, they smoke inside the barns. Probably I wouldn't tell them either. But and then sometimes they re-enter without showering, and then we had a couple cases where they kind of treated not only inside the barn, but they treated the area around the outside of the barn as a clean area. So they felt like they could walk out, and as long as they didn't get too far from the barns, they were still clean and they would walk back in without showering. So no real good clean, dirty line in that case, and you certainly got opportunity to contaminate that area. All right, and then we had one case in particular where there was a farm manager actually there's 2 cases. The farm manager was transitioning to a new job in one case, and so he was probably only there half the time. So nobody was watching the store. And then another case, they had a real high employee turnover, and a couple of the employees were really disgruntled, and they observed them purposely breaking biosecurity protocols, and they strongly suspect that they actually left one day and went and interviewed at another farm and then didn't tell anybody, but had a case like that too. All right, I am probably running very short on time here, but I am going to real quickly run through, I got a couple minutes, this study here, evaluation of a bench entry into sow farms, again because we're trying to learn from what we're doing here so we can do research that's relevant for you. And so one of the things we found early on, or thought we found early on, was, well, okay, employee entry is a risk. And so these bench entry systems we think is a good way to do that, so we wanted to evaluate one of those. And to do that, we use this glow germ powder, this fluorescent powder. It's about the size of bacteria, 5 microns. We're more concerned about representing contamination than actual virus or bacteria. But we set up a very simple study where the experimental unit was 1 day, 1 shower stall, and 4 employees. So every day those same well, not the same employee, 4 employees every day, about the same 4 every day would go through that one shower stall, and that would be one experimental unit. We had 2 treatment groups, one with the bench, one with no bench, and so in both cases we had the shower. So the shower was the typical practice on this farm, and then they either had a bench or not a bench for our study. 10 days each one. And then we just randomized on the day of the week so that all the Mondays didn't end up in no bench and all the Fridays in bench. We just randomized then each day to the 2 treatment groups. Here was kind of the basic setup. Here's our area of contamination. Here's the door to the shower that they were using. Here's a shoe rack, and then we got the bench in bench days. And no bench days, we just took that bench away. It was removable, and then they would just stand here and take their shoes off and place them on here like they normally did before. Okay? So the idea here is you walked here with contamination, now you're standing in, you take your shoes off and you step right back down with what is essentially a Swiffer, your socks, and you're stepping right into contamination, right? So the idea with the bench is you sit down here and you take off your shoe, and without placing your sock feet down, you swing it over the bench. Okay, that's the idea. Here was the sampling point. So we sampled glow germ contamination here, after the bench, right before the bench, after the bench, dirty side of the shower, clean side of the shower. Here was, we did train them ahead of time. Here was the poster that the student used to train them. That hung on the wall here. And then in addition to that, the students stood there every day and watched them. And if they started to set their foot down, they'd say, don't do that. Okay? So they made sure they didn't violate that. If they did, we scrapped that day. It didn't happen, but we would have scrapped that day. All right, here's how we measure contamination then. 5 by 5 centimeter squares in this PVC pipe with string that was fluorescent. And so if we observed contamination, glow germ inside one of these squares, that counted as 1. There was 270 of these squares in that grid. Here's the results. Before the bench, we had almost all the contamination in almost all the squares, with both bench and no bench. After the bench, when we measured, there was a significant lower level of contamination with the bench than without the bench. But by the time you got to the dirty side of the shower, there was no difference. And on the clean side of the shower, it wasn't statistically different, but we never found contamination with the bench in place, and we did on a couple days with the no bench. All right, just to point those out, here's a day. Part of why we didn't see a significant difference here is we had one day with the bench in place where one of the ladies had pants that hung this far below her shoes. And so she took her shoes off, and as she swung her leg over, the bottom of her pants leg swooped through the glow germ, and it created a plume of powder on the other side. And so we had this one day that was really kind of an outlier here. And the student really wanted to throw that outlier out. They said, oh, that didn't count. But that's not how research is done. We could have did that, but that would not be an ethical way to do that. And so that really contributed, though, to that one day. And then the other thing I just want to point out from this, and I know Austin's ready to give me the hook here, but we had these 2 days here where we did have contamination that made its way through the shower and got to the clean side of the shower when there was no bench. We didn't have any when we had the bench in place. And we saw it on the door handles here. They saw it on the bench here. They saw it on locker handles here. And so lots of this glow germ would make its way into the showers. Takeaway message is that the bench, I think, did its job, but it was very inconsistent. It does, to us anyway, it really emphasized the need to focus on compliance and execution. Okay, so even the best laid plans, people figure out ways to mess that up. We do it ourselves. We did this ahead of time. I won't mention who it was, but faculty members in our department, when they took their shoes off, they grabbed the bottom of their shoe with their hand. And so then they had this all over their hand, right? So that happens, and that happened in the study here. So that's footwear handling, employee clothing, the long pants, and then finally, I want to emphasize that if you put layers in, so you got the shower and the bench, you got multiple things that have to go wrong for that contamination to occur on the clean side of the shower. And that's what I think the bench does. It creates, if something happens, they don't do a good job showering, at least you've got another layer in there that something had to fail at the bench. And so that's why we kind of focus on or emphasize the need to do the layering. So, Austin, I apologize, I'm a couple minutes over a bit.
Can you flip back to that slide where you
Yeah, I think I can get to it. Go ahead and ask your question while I'm flipping. Oh, okay. Yeah, here you go.
Is there a disinfectant that you think is better than another?
Well, no. First of all, it depends on the pathogen. We've done a lot of work with accelerated hydrogen peroxide. We looked at Virkon. We looked at Synergize. Most of those, if you give them the right conditions to work, they'll work, right? I like the accelerated hydrogen peroxide if you run it through a foamer because it gives you a really nice foam, and we think it does stay effective in the face of quite a bit of organic matter. I think Virkon probably does the same thing. Synergize, I think the advantage of that is it's cheap, right? It's probably a little bit more hazardous to people, but the Virkon and the AHP are both going to be pretty safe for people. Cost is sometimes an issue there, but yeah. But I think both PRRS and PED are enveloped RNA viruses, and so both of them are pretty easy to kill. Most disinfectants, if again under the right conditions, will kill them. Yeah, yeah. The question was PRRS and feed. Yeah, what do we know about that? Yeah. I don't think it's a big issue there because of the conditions. It's more likely with PED because of the importance of manure, but feces is excreted, or PRRS virus is excreted in feces too, so it could happen the same way. But it's if you look at the time lags between when you've got a potential contamination and when the feed is actually consumed, unless it happens sort of in a loading process or near that, I don't think feed's a big deal with PRRS. It's not huge on my list. So.
Okay, let's keep moving. Let's give Dr.